I would like to welcome Rebecca Perlman, who is currently an assistant professor of politics and international affairs here at Princeton University. Rebecca holds a doctorate in political science from Stanford, a master's from the Fletcher School of Tufts, and a bachelor's from Princeton. Sadly, she's going to be leaving Princeton this summer to join UC Berkeley as an assistant professor of political science, but we're really thrilled to have her here today to present on some of her current research. Rebecca's primary field of research is international political economy, with a focus on regulatory politics, the governance of multinational firms, and environmental policy. She has publications in a number of prominent journals, including the American Journal of Political Science, Science Advances, and International Studies Quarterly. Rebecca's book, Regulating Risk: How Private Information Shapes Global Safety Standards, which was just published under 2 weeks ago, combines data and qualitative evidence from the pesticide, pharmaceutical, and chemical sectors to demonstrate how companies have exploited product safety information to enhance their profits and create barriers to commerce that disadvantage developing countries. Today, however, she'll be presenting on some of her very relevant research on extreme weather events and the politics of climate change attribution. So please join me in welcoming Rebecca. Thank you.
All right, thank you everyone. It's great to see such a big audience. So the paper that I'm presenting today is co-authored with Zuhad Hai. He's currently finishing up his PhD at Stanford, but will actually be at Princeton next year as a Niehaus postdoc. So I encourage all of you, if you're here, to reach out to him. He's continuing to do a lot of work in this space. So I think we can all agree, since we're here, that climate change is really one of the most important issues of our current time. And yet, for most of our lives, it's really been viewed as a future problem, a mitigation problem. So if we don't reduce our emissions today, then at some uncertain point in the future, we'll experience those consequences. And yet, increasingly, in just the past few years, we're starting to see that climate change is also very much a current problem, one that we're actually experiencing today, in the form of more severe storms, flooding, and as this picture demonstrates, more extreme wildfires. So this shift from climate change being kind of conceived of and really being, in some sense, more of a problem we were going to experience in the future, to a problem that we're already starting to see the consequences of, that shift has kind of been apparent in the media. We've kind of seen increasingly articles that have started talking about the fact that climate change is here. We're seeing it happening in real time. We're also increasingly seeing some politicians acknowledge that this is happening, that we're already seeing climate change's consequences. And yet, at the same time, there remains a lot of hesitance, especially in political quarters, among politicians to really acknowledge that some of the extreme weather events that we're seeing are in fact related to climate change. So we saw that actually in the 2020 California wildfires. We don't usually think of California as a state in which there's climate denialism very prevalent, and yet even in California we saw that politicians were kind of not willing to acknowledge this link between climate change and the increased severity of some of those fires. We also saw this very prominently in Australia during the 2019-2020 bushfires, when the Australian Prime Minister very controversially essentially said there is no link between these really horrible bushfires and climate change. They're not related. So this kind of dichotomy that you're seeing among politicians and their willingness to attribute these extreme weather events to climate change is what we kind of think is interesting and worthy of study. And the reason that we think it's interesting and kind of important to understand a bit more is because there's this big literature that shows that elite rhetoric, or the rhetoric from politicians and other people in positions of power, has a really important impact on shaping general beliefs and perceptions. So it seems like this failure by a number of politicians to kind of acknowledge this link between extreme weather events and climate change is kind of a missed opportunity. It's a missed opportunity to perhaps drive home the importance of doing something about climate change before it becomes too late to really prevent the worst consequences. You could even view it as a missed opportunity in the sense that To the extent that certain disasters, like with the California wildfires, could be blamed on human error, maybe there wasn't good forest management, maybe they should have been doing other things. If you say, look, this is climate change, this is a global problem, perhaps it's a way to kind of diffuse blame. So it's a little surprising, we think, that there's been this unwillingness to acknowledge this link in many quarters. At the same time, there really hasn't been any real research trying to understand what are the political trade-offs of attributing extreme weather events to climate change. So we don't really know what the potential consequences or benefits of that even are. And that's where we're kind of coming from. So the question that motivates this project is first, what explains attribution hesitancy? And I mean the willingness to attribute extreme weather events to climate change. What explains that in the United States, where we're focused, even as the science linking these events becomes increasingly clear? And then more broadly, we want to understand what are the political consequences of politicians attributing these extreme weather events to climate change. So to preview the answer that I'm going to show you some evidence of today, we find that when politicians attribute extreme weather events to climate change, it actually ends up undermining support for that politician among Republican voters. And it also undermines support for efforts to adapt to the extreme weather events themselves. We also find that these negative effects that we see among Republicans, you might think, well, at least they're going to be balanced out among Democrats with positive effects. We don't find that. We find that they're actually not fully balanced out among Democrats. So just to preview what I'm going to be kind of where the rest of this talk is going, I'm going to very, very briefly walk through the literature about what we know about the science and politics of attribution. I'm going to talk through some observational data that we collected. So this entailed looking at congressional press releases and kind of the actual state of the world in terms of attribution. Oops. I'm then going to introduce our theory of what we might expect to happen when politicians attribute extreme weather events to climate change. I will provide our evidence in support of that theory, which in this case is we did some experiments, large-scale experiments in the United States in 2 waves. And then I'll just kind of conclude with what I think are the broader implications and, of course, open it up to questions. OK, so as most of you probably know, the science linking extreme weather events and climate change has become increasingly clear. This, I think, came through particularly strongly in the 2018 IPCC report, where it was basically said, there's no longer any doubt that we're seeing the consequences of climate change in these various forms. And we also know that when individuals are exposed to extreme weather events, including fires and storms, that it can actually shape their beliefs and even their behaviors around climate change. And we know that there are some kind of political variation within that, but there's kind of evidence that people, at least in their minds, are frequently linking these 2 events to some degree. What we don't know is kind of what happens when people make the link between extreme weather events and climate change more explicit. Kind of what are the consequences of that, the political consequences. So the first thing that we wanted to do is we just wanted to understand what is the state of the world. What does the state of attribution actually look like today? And in order to do that, we scraped congressional press releases that were distributed between 2009 and 2020 that were related to extreme weather events. So in order to kind of identify those press releases, we had a variety of words that we searched for in the title of these press releases that could help us identify press releases that were primarily about extreme weather. Within that corpus of press releases about extreme weather events, we then wanted to identify press releases that dealt with climate change as well. So are these politicians referencing climate change when talking about these extreme weather events? So to do that, we had a number of phrases that capture climate change, things like warming planet, climate crisis, climate change, et cetera. OK, so here's kind of what the state of the world looks like. So in the top panel, you have Democrats, and in the bottom panel, you have Republican politicians. And the gray bars are just the count of press releases on extreme weather events. And the black bars are the count of those press releases that also deal with climate change. The green line that is kind of running across the screen is the percentage of press releases that deal with climate change that are also talking about extreme weather events. And then these red lines, we put in there the release of the IPCC reports, because kind of over time you see increasing certainty in those IPCC reports. So to the extent that politicians are kind of taking the science and then responding to it, you would expect to see a big increase in the percentage of these press releases referencing climate change. You do see some of that increase among the Democrats, although it never gets above more than 20% of linking, or it's always under 20% of talking about climate change in these extreme weather event press releases. And Republicans, you don't really see much increase at all. Just, this isn't just about the type of extreme weather events. So you might be worried, we're just capturing too wide of a corpus, and some extreme weather events are more scientifically linked, of course, to climate change. When you break this down, look at just wildfires, just hurricanes, et cetera, you see a very similar pattern. Even with wildfires, the percentage remains very low. So this isn't just about the type of extreme weather events. It's kind of, the trend upwards is, I think, not as high as we might expect given where the science is at. So the question is why? What might be going on with that? So what we think, oh yes, of course.
I'm just curious how much of the blinking is positive or negative?
So it does seem like it's mostly kind of saying it is positive, like it is saying it's mostly Democrats, as you saw, and it's usually something like there are these wildfires that we've been experiencing. They're really terrible. They were made worse by climate change, or because of climate change, we're going to see more of these extreme weather events in the future. You don't really see people saying, we experience these flooding. It has nothing to do with climate change. Don't look behind the curtain. That's not really what you see. So it is more kind of acknowledging some sort of link.
And it's monarchistic within Republicans too.
I'm sorry?
Like if Republicans are the same.
Yes, when you see it, it is kind of typically looks like that. Because why would you mention climate change why would you put it in the same press release, if not to kind of have some relationship? Yes, it is possible you could say Democrats are saying this about climate change. It isn't. Yeah, we didn't really see that. It's possible there are one or two like that, but that's certainly not, we kind of went through it and tried to understand, what this was looking like, and that was certainly not the modal press release at all. Yeah, we didn't see any, I guess I would say, that looked like that. So I don't think there were very many, if any. Any other questions? You're welcome to interrupt. I really don't mind interruptions. Okay. All right, so what do we think might actually be going on here? So we think that when politicians attribute extreme weather events to climate change, they could have this backlash effect. It's often called a boomerang effect in the literature. So we think it could prime Republicans on their partisan identities, because climate change has become so politically polarized in the United States. And then that's going to create this backlash effect, as I said, and it's going to come out in a variety of ways. So first, we think that it could make the politicians seem less sympathetic towards victims, victims of the extreme weather event, because it makes them seem like they're just this partisan actor. They're trying to have this partisan positioning, and they're not really concerned with what's actually happened. They're just using it as a talking point. It also might, to some Republicans, suggest a lack of understanding of what's actually going on in terms of the extreme weather event and what's actually driving it, to the extent that Republicans are more likely to be skeptical of climate change and the degree to which we're seeing its consequences today. Finally, we think that it could just elicit this emotional response. Again, this is a very partisan thing in this country, and so to the extent that you're mentioning climate change, it could just make them kind of feel negative emotions towards this entire event, towards this politician. We also think there is going to be this spillover effect into adaptation itself. So normally, if you just say, okay, there's been this wildfire, it's really bad, we should do something to help the victims, that's not political. But if you say, hey, there's been this wildfire and it's partially because of climate change, suddenly the wildfire itself starts to take on these political connotations. So perhaps responding to that wildfire also takes on political connotations, whereas before it wouldn't. At the same time, we think there's going to be a much lesser effect among Democrats, because for Democrats, it's largely viewed as just a scientific fact. It's less partisan. And so we don't think that you're going to see kind of these same effects in among Democrats. So to kind of put this in more clear hypotheses, we expect that climate attribution will undermine support for the politician making the attribution among Republicans. We think that's also going to undermine support for the disaster response among Republicans, and we think the effect on Democrats should be fairly negligible. Okay, so how did we test this? We did an online survey experiment. We used the platform Lucid to do this, and we got a representative sample of US adults. We did this in 2 waves, which I'll talk about why. So the first wave was conducted in July 2021, and we sent it out to approximately 3,000 respondents. We then did a second wave, you'll see why, in October, which had approximately double the number of respondents. In both of the waves, they look very similar. We had a short vignette where we talked about the 2020 wildfires in the western United States. Part of the reason we focused on that is if you look at the attribution in the press releases, that was kind of one of the biggest events in terms of level of attribution. There was also a lot of scientific evidence that suggested that wildfires there were exacerbated by climate change. So we thought it was a good case to really focus on. We presented a realistic statement that was actually based on real congressional press releases, but it was from a fake politician. We were very clear about that to the respondents. In the control version, there was no reference to climate change. So this looks, again, very similar to how the press releases looked. In the treatment version, there was a reference to climate change. Okay, so here's what survey respondents actually saw. We first said, we gave them this little introductory text. The following text is based on a real statement made during the wildfires by a politician in one of the impacted states. This is after they'd been told about the wildfires. Please read the politician's statement carefully. After you have read it, we will ask for your opinions. And here's the statement. So the red, bolded, bracketed text is what the treatment was. So obviously it wouldn't have been red or bracketed or bold in what they saw, but this is just to show you the difference between the control and the treatment. So it said, we are no stranger to wildfires in our great state, but the wildfires this year have been particularly severe, and then in the treatment, partially as a result of climate change. We need to work together to fight these fires now, support our communities in the aftermath, and later work to prevent future devastation from climate change. In meeting the immediate challenge of the fires that are already burning, we are enormously grateful, blah, 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 blah. Okay, so this is what respondents saw. The question is, how does this treatment of linking these wildfires to climate change their response to the politician and to adaptation? So we asked them a number of questions. So first, we wanted to kind of get at how respondents view the politician in terms of competence. So we asked, after reading the statement by the politician, how confident are you that the politician will be an effective advocate for federal disaster relief, has a good understanding of wildfires and their causes, and will work to prevent future wildfires? We also wanted to get at this idea of sympathy. So you could imagine a situation where maybe it's not just Republicans that view the politician as less sympathetic. Maybe kind of Democrats too say, why are you kind of grandstanding here? You should be focused on the victims, and by talking about wildfires, you're actually kind of being a really partisan actor, and that's affecting how your level of sympathy. So we wanted to separate out kind of competence and sympathy, and make sure that we really understood what was going on, and this wasn't just a broad-based phenomenon outside of just Republicans. So we said, based on the politician's statement, how sympathetic or unsympathetic did the politician seem towards those impacted? And then finally, we wanted to get at whether or not this had this backlash effect against adapting to the wildfires themselves. So we told respondents the government is considering imposing an energy tax to protect against future wildfires and other natural disasters. This tax is projected to increase the average American household's energy bill by 10 to 20%. How likely would you be to support this new tax? Okay, so these are the kind of outcome questions that we have. Just very briefly to show you the summary statistics in case any of you are curious. The main takeaway here, Democrats are more positive across the board. They're more positive about the politician. They're more positive about taxes. That part's not that surprising. But there's no real concerns about ceiling effects. Like, there's actually a fair bit of room across all of these questions for Republicans and Democrats to move up or down. So that's kind of important to know. So this is the first set of the results. So these are the results on how confident you are that the politician essentially is going to, have a good understanding of wildfires. In the top panel, will work to prevent future wildfires. In the middle panel, and will be an effective advocate for federal disaster relief. And what we see is pretty consistently across the board is that there's not a major effect on Democrats. I mean, there's a positive effect, but it's not statistically significant across any of these specifications. Whereas there is a very negative effect that in the top 2 at least is statistically significant of there being this backlash effect against the views of the politician's competence. I think the reason, by the way, that we suspect the effective advocate one was not significant among Republicans is at the time Biden was president, so they might be thinking it's harder to link, how effective they'll be with a Democratic president. So that might have looked different, for example, when Trump was president. What we also think is especially interesting is, not quite there yet. In terms of the sympathy, we don't see an effect with Democrats. So this is not the case that just everyone is thinking this politician is grandstanding. We see a very negative effect, however, with Republicans, where they think the politician is less sympathetic. So that is kind of in line with our expectations. And then what we think is the most interesting is kind of, as we expected, this backlash spills over into people's willingness to do something kind of about these wildfires at all. And we think that's really important to understand because, to the extent that we might expect, look, if people just understand that these wildfires and these other events are going to become more common and are really serious, and this is linked to climate change, that will help us address them. Well, this is showing one kind of element where this might actually make things harder. And it's very depressing, but it's also, we think, important. But of course, after presenting this paper the first time, someone pointed out to us, a very helpful discussant, look, there's a problem with the way that you did this. People are probably just anticipating that they're inferring the politician's party based on this treatment because, Democrats, as we even saw in our press releases, are more likely to talk about climate change. So you're not really capturing anything beyond people just inferring the politician's party. So we said, yeah, that's a good point. We need to go fix that. So what we did was we wanted to figure out, would Republicans respond more positively if they knew this was in fact a Republican? Important question. And we also realized that there was more that we could do. Oh, is there a question in the back? Yes? Maybe you'll address it, actually. Oh, OK, sure. So we wanted to kind of get at the mechanism better. Why aren't Democrats moving? Like, why is there kind of this null effect here? And just kind of also ask the question of, I can't remember if this is, we might think the whole point of linking these two things is not for, responding to the wildfire. It's that people will start reducing emissions to not have future wildfires. So we also said, we're not asking questions about mitigation. We're only asking questions about adaptation. So we should have included that too. So we went back into the field. And this time, we now tell respondents whether or not, oh, it is still a question. Yes?
Yeah, sorry. Were you able to make a distinction between how people felt, or people's responses to these questions based on the ethnic demographics of the people most impacted?
So we did actually look, we had some robustness checks where we checked whether people who had experienced wildfires, who knew people who had been displaced due to wildfires, whether there was a different response there. It looks exactly the same, essentially. And also we looked at whether or not people who were more spent more time talking about climate change, whether they look different. We looked at, it turns out a pretty high percentage of our sample, the vast majority even of Republicans, did believe in climate change. We looked at whether, for those who believed in climate change, whether you still see the backlash effect, because someone said maybe it's just they don't believe in it. Same thing. So it's, no matter what we did, no matter how we cut the data, you get these same results. But this was a pretty important thing because, if you just think they're just responding to the politician, I mean, that shouldn't necessarily affect this response to adaptation, but it should affect the response to the politician. So that's a pretty serious critique. So now we tell them, is it a Republican or a Democrat? And then we did everything all over again. Same effects. So now you can see on the left is when we told them it's a Democrat. On the right, when you tell them it's a Republican. Again, this is a less sympathetic individual when they mention climate change. Again, they are less confident the politician will work to prevent future wildfires. Again, pretty much looks the same with Republicans thinking whether they'll be an effective advocate. Less strong effect. We see that when it's Republicans, again, it's not significant. Oh, yes, go ahead.
So what is your thinking on what the Republicans view as the cause of wildfires? What is because I'm thinking, are the Republicans just thinking that we should invest more in fire management and then negative reaction to the tax is because that would take money from fire management? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I might kind of get there in a moment, but if not, let's revisit that and talk about it more. Because we do have some more additional evidence on kind of what we think might be going on with Republicans and the mechanism, but it might not totally answer that. So let me know if you still have questions. Oh, more questions. Okay, yes.
Small clarification. So the Republican politicians are talking to Republican respondents, and the Democrat politician is talking to Democrat respondents.
It's randomized. So we just we randomized whether respondents saw that it was a Democrat or Republican. So this is showing so on the left panel, for example, you're seeing how Republicans are responding to a Democrat politician who does or does not mention climate change as the effective treatment. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, so I mean, we didn't look at that for the paper because that wasn't so much the research question. The question was more, I think that they are, for the most part. I don't remember, I don't have the exact results. But for many of them, I believe that they were, but I cannot tell you that across the board. Yeah, even though the confidence intervals are overlapping does not mean that they themselves wouldn't be statistically significant in that photo. Regardless, I think the point, though, was more for us about whether you're seeing a backlash among Republicans, because to the extent that politicians need to appeal to Republicans, that's still what matters. It's not about whether the coefficients between Democrats and Republicans are different. That's not necessarily the relevant question. It's about how is this going to affect your voter base. And also the fact that for Democrats, it's not moving them really one way or the other. You're basically just losing voters potentially, but not necessarily gaining them, if that makes sense. Yeah. Well, but the question is how you're moving relative to the null of it's not having an effect on you. So the question is, within groups, can we rule out the null that there is no effect of this treatment on this group? And for Republicans, we can, and for Democrats, we can't. But the difference between them is not really the question that we're asking. Okay. Great. Okay. Again, just basically, the results are consistent across the board was kind of the point here. And it's just the same. So that gave us confidence, at least, that this isn't just about respondents anticipating the party of the politician, which is not to say, to be clear, that they're not anticipating something about what type of Republican this is. And in fact, that's relevant. We don't want to rule that out. I mean, it is signaling something. And that is certainly possible, but even, it's showing that even if you're a Republican, saying these things can hurt you. And that's what we kind of want to know, because the question is, what are the political incentives for these politicians who want to get reelected of saying these things? So we wanted to then, as I said, come back to the mechanism. So we were trying to think, all right, we suspect the reason Democrats aren't moving is because in their minds, they already know that the wildfires and the climate change is potentially linked. And so it's not changing their priors about the state of the world. So we wanted to try and get at that. And the way that we thought to do it was to ask, do you think wildfires will be more common in the future? Because if Democrats don't change their priors, then it suggests they already are linking the two, whereas if they kind of see this link, maybe they would be more inclined to think they'll be more common, because we know climate change is increasing. Here's what we find. So we did find what we expected with the Democrats, but we also found something we did not expect and did not pre-register with the Republicans, that we then were like, what is going on here and how can this help us think about what else we're seeing? So the Republicans say that wildfires are actually going to become less common in the future when treated with this link between climate change, which seems crazy, right? Why are they doing that? So we think, oh, sorry, was there a question? Yeah, well, we think there are two possibilities here, because there's kind of different theories about some of these things of what's going on. So one possibility is this idea, it's a concept known as motivated reasoning. So the idea is that people kind of take their priors about the world, and then when they kind of are told something that doesn't fit this cognitive dissonance situation, they then kind of figure out a way to still impose their priors on the world that makes sense to them. Okay, so motivated reasoning we know can lead to various types of boomerang effects, which is a backlash effect, essentially what we're talking about. And in particular, people have shown that messages with specific intent can backfire and cause an increase in the unhealthy or antisocial attitude or behavior targeted for change. So a complete, nonsensical, unexpected outcome. So what do we think is happening here? So this one possibility, so what we saw in the data is the baseline belief among untreated Republicans is that wildfires will become more common in the future. So everyone kind of across the board is like, yeah, we think we'll probably see more wildfires in the future for whatever reason. But then it's possible that this treatment suddenly makes them say, oh, wait, wildfires are linked to climate change. No, that's not true. So, my prior that wildfires will be more common in the future, we've got to throw that out. And now we have to decide that the seeming increase we've seen in the news about wildfires is just due to chance. It's an aberration. And so that means that wildfires will actually be less common in the future. Or at least less common than, not less common, but not more common. So no more common, since the baseline is more common. And then that might also make Republicans decide, well, if wildfires aren't going to be more common in the future, and this is an aberration, it's a blip, why do we need an increase in tax to deal with wildfires when they're not actually going to be a big deal in the future? This is a blip. So that's one possibility. And maybe that's going on. But there's another possibility too, and we can't rule it out. We also know that individuals engage in something known as partisan cheerleading, where they just like to find various times when they can kind of cheer for their party and toe the party line. So it's possible that treated Republicans are not actually sincerely saying wildfires, in fact, aren't going to be more common in the future. They're actually retaining their original beliefs about wildfires. And instead, they're saying insincerely that, in fact, future wildfires are going to be less likely. And then they similarly express disapproval of the tax, not because they think it's going to be unnecessary, but because they now view it along these partisan lines, and they want to again show that they are true partisans and you're not going to support this. Now, importantly for us, although we cannot differentiate between those two mechanisms, like we are not able to do that in our survey, to us it's almost irrelevant in terms of the policy implications, because in either case, you're getting this backlash, which suggests that from a politician's perspective, who needs to appeal to Republican voters, there is a danger here in linking these two events. So as I mentioned, we also wanted to get in the second wave at another question, which is, okay, maybe this is bad for adaptation, maybe it's bad for the politician, but I mean the real argument of why you might want politicians to link these things is because it's good for mitigation. It drives home that this is a big deal, we're already seeing the effects, we need to do something now. So we wanted to also figure out whether we could kind of move people in becoming more concerned about doing stuff to reduce the impacts of climate change. So all of these questions came after the previous set of questions because we didn't want to unintentionally treat respondents and mention climate change earlier in the survey. So after we've kind of done all the things that I already showed you the results for, we asked respondents, or we said to respondents, we previously asked if you would support a tax to protect against wildfires and other natural disasters. Imagine that instead the government was considering a tax to reduce the emissions that cause climate change. This alternative tax would similarly increase the average American household's energy bill by 10 to 20%. How likely would you be to support such a tax? So what do you think is going to happen? Well, basically nothing. We just don't see much of it. In fact, there's not that positive effect that we might hope for among Democrats, where you might think, we're driving home the point that climate change is a big deal, and hopefully that would move them. You see a little bit of movement, when it's a Republican politician, but it's so inconsistent that I don't think we can read much into this. Then we also tried to say, okay, maybe individual behavior. Maybe we'll see something in individual behavior. So we kind of asked respondents about, various steps they might take in their daily life to kind of reduce their carbon footprint. And we gave them a variety of options. And then we kind of made a score for them to see, whether the treatment is moving them. Again, nothing all that optimistic here. Just don't see that much effect. To be clear, we don't take this as, okay, there's no benefit of linking these two events. It's possible that the benefits have already been linked in Democrats' minds. So like this treatment has effectively already happened to those who are most likely to be impacted by it. So our takeaway is not there is no benefit here. Let's just not say anything. It's more to drive home the point that there are in fact potential downsides that politicians are seemingly probably incorporating, which is probably part of the reason why they are not being more willing to make these links explicit. So summing up, and I know people have to leave. I can see everyone already has, some people have to go to class. So as climate change becomes more visible, we've actually seen a lot of pressure on politicians to acknowledge the link between climate change and extreme weather events. And a lot of people have said, they are, doing the wrong thing by not being explicit about this. I don't know what they're doing here. As it turns out, there is a reason. So we asked, what are these political trade-offs when politicians attribute? We showed that it can backfire by undermining support for the politician, and also, we think even more interestingly, potentially undermining support for policies to address the future consequences of climate change, and this is solely among Republicans. We show that this effect occurs regardless of who is attributing, whether it's a Democrat or a Republican. And then we find that any positive effects that we do see among Democrats are kind of smaller, inconsistent, and so kind of don't create a clear counter to the Republican effects. We also, as I said, we don't find much support that attribution leads to increased support for climate action, although we are very clear that we don't want to read into that too strongly in the paper. So what are the broader takeaways? So I think one of them is that, as we are trying to balance, increasingly we understand that we need to work on adaptation as well as mitigation because, we've already gone too far and, we can try and pull back and we hopefully will try and pull back, but we are also going to need to deal with the disasters that we're going to see as a result of climate change. But that can actually introduce trade-offs with also trying to encourage people to reduce emissions. To the extent we think that attributing could help with mitigation, although we don't find much evidence of it, that is creating a backlash on adaptation. And so we need to be cognizant of that. So yes, as I said, what is good for mitigation may be bad for adaptation. And then, the fact that we're seeing that Republicans and even often moderate Democrats, like you actually even saw with Gavin Newsom when he had the recall campaign, it was very interesting. He's not shied away in many cases from linking the California wildfires to climate change. But when it came to the recall campaign, there was no mention of climate change because that was a Republican-led effort. There were a lot of Republican voters in that recall campaign. They were very mobilized. He did not mention climate change, but he did talk about wildfires. So I think even moderate Democrats or Democrats who have to, appeal to Republicans are, being savvy potentially by not mentioning climate change. So that's all I have. And yeah, I look forward to your questions. Yes.
Thank you. That was an interesting survey report. I noticed in your results for both the adaptation and attribution results that Democratic respondents seem to be more supportive of Republican politicians if they go the path or whether it would be wildfires or compared to the Democratic politicians. Can you talk a little bit about the mechanism or whether we can use that result?
Yeah, I mean, it's not something that we delve into because we mainly viewed those results as a robustness check on our original findings. Although I think it intuitively makes sense, right? In the sense that you're now viewing this as a non-MAGA, I guess, Republican is probably you're having some sort of prime about what type of Republican is this. And so maybe that's kind of, having more of an effect. Whereas a Democrat, you just assume they're probably the sort of Democrat who would mention, whether or not they're mentioning it, you're not necessarily thinking in the back of your head, they're probably avoiding mentioning it, right? It just doesn't occur to you that a Democrat would necessarily avoid mentioning it or not. So when they do mention it, it doesn't, move you that much because the fact they didn't mention it doesn't stand out. But when a Republican mentions it, you're like, oh, that's unexpected that they would do that. So it moves you more. So I think that's probably what's going on.
Is there lack of trust among the Democratic Republicans whether they will actually follow through?
I'm not sure I would interpret it that way, but again, it wasn't really the focus. I don't want to, kind of go too far into it because it just wasn't. We really viewed this as, wanting to make sure our results on, the kind of original results are right. And so when we did this, we didn't pre-register kind of expectations along those lines, which is why I shy away from kind of reading into it too much. Yes?
So if I were a policymaker, it seems like prescription if I wanted to get reelected is not to mention anything about attribution to climate change. I'm wondering if, with your current research or future research, there are ways in which you can show that climate change can be mentioned in a way that doesn't affect my reelection if I were wanting to make sure to drive home the point of climate change being a real issue.
Yeah, I think so. Not my work, but there's other work, including by actually a current NEHAUS fellow, Noah Zucker. He's working with Ricky Clark, where they've done some work that kind of tries to understand, can climate change, such as things like with the Paris Agreement, if you kind of don't follow through on your commitments under Paris, even though you were a politician that perhaps you didn't sign Paris, does that benefit you or hurt you? And they do find that there can be consequences, for example, of not following through on your commitments to kind of reduce emissions. So, and it can have real effect with voters' vote choice, more among Democrats. I think this isn't to say that politicians shouldn't mention climate change or basically we should just can't say anything or nothing will get done. I think it's more just about focusing on a particular mechanism that I think should be taken into account or is being taken into account and trying to understand what that looks like. And I also think that it's possible that things will shift. As there's an open question of as it becomes even more difficult for people to ignore what is happening in terms of climate change, will Republicans finally come around and will it become less partisan? Then these results would change. So this is, I feel like it's a snapshot of what the world looks like today. And I don't want to say that, our takeaway should be, politicians should never mention these things or they won't get reelected. I think it's just about understanding, that there are some trade-offs that politicians are probably taking into account already that should be thought about. Yes?
Yeah, so a bit back to the question before, because I got that the mechanisms were about this like backfire effect. But like, what is the original mechanism? Is it that like Republicans, they will want to prefer to do nothing and they don't believe in climate change, or are they believing that there are alternative solutions? So like a big signal, I guess, is that you sort of say, no, this is not due to climate change, this is due to bad forest management, this is due to the incumbents not being able to handle it well. And like, it's also unclear for me why there's a fire and then you want to give more in energy taxes because you would like be interested in some more immediate solution, more, and this speaks maybe to this final slide here with adaptation, you're more interested in like immediate disaster alleviating things. So how are you thinking about the Republicans, what they are thinking about the causes, and is there like this competition with the
Yes, let me try. Come back, keep asking if I don't quite get to it. I think that, so one of the things, in terms of, what are Republicans thinking? Is it just that they think this is the wrong, talking about climate change is the wrong focus essentially, or it's kind of focusing on something too long term? I don't think that's just it, in the sense that, so first of all, you're seeing, these kind of negative effects across a bunch of different questions that don't just touch on that. So like things about the sympathy, you get a very strong and consistent effect on whether this politician is sympathetic or not. I also think that, as far as the adaptation tax, like the tax that would help protect against future wildfires, that's a pretty immediate response. I mean, this isn't saying we're going to, reduce emissions, which was the subsequent question. This is, we're just going to tax people in order to protect, make sure that in the future, victims are more protected. I mean, there's no reason that, aside from kind of, I think, some of the mechanisms that we discussed, like, there's no reason that someone who even doesn't link climate and wildfires should say, oh no, that's the wrong response, and that should lead to the backlash. Like, I don't quite see how that mechanism would play out, I guess. I mean, I will say, the Republicans in the sample do believe climate change is happening. Whether they believe that climate change is, we're already seeing the consequences of it, is, I think, a different question. But I think that kind of more what's happening is they're just, it's more this kind of emotional and partisan prime, I think, that is driving these effects. And even if they think, maybe, dealing with climate change isn't the way of dealing with the forest fires, that again, it shouldn't play out in all of the different ways that we see. It should play out, potentially would play out in some, but I think that's why we try to, get at it in different ways. But it's a valid question and one we kind of grappled with when doing this. Yes? Yeah, so I mean, I think it would carry over to Australia, for example, where I think you see similar political dynamics to the US. I think you're completely right that in a lot of Europe, there's just much more interest in climate change. Obviously the European Union has much more green-friendly policies. They're now essentially going to get rid of gas cars, I think, by whatever it was, make it impossible to sell new gas cars. I think there's just like a much greater acceptance that this is a problem, and there's just been much more effort on the part of government to deal with it. So I mean, you still might see it in kind of the conservative elements within some of these European countries that are, there have been obviously this pushback in Germany and France and elsewhere against some of these climate policies. So I think you would still potentially see it there, but I think that, like, on the whole, it is not going to cause the same election consequences for those politicians because it's a much more broad-based group that looks effectively like Democrats, where it's not going to lead to a backlash. Yes?
I wonder, so in the short term, it's detrimental maybe for Republicans to mention climate change in their discourse, but in the long term, maybe there is a big picture effect of changing the party line itself. If repeatedly Republican politicians are going to speak about climate change and maybe be less popular later, but maybe if this happens repeatedly, the party line itself can change and the effect can reverse.
Absolutely.
As you alluded to before.
Right, absolutely. I mean, and that's why I say I think this is a snapshot in time, and I hope that it will change. And I think the point is more, how do we understand, why politicians are so hesitant? Why are they doing what they're doing today? And I think, this helps us understand that. Like, we might just think, oh, they're just appealing to oil interests, and it's really just about that. And that's like the simple answer. But I think there's more going on. I think it is also about their voter base. And you're completely right. I mean, these things can shift, and this paper may have no relevance in 10 years. I kind of hope it doesn't. But right now, I think this is what the world looks like. Yes?
Great job.
Thanks.
So you were showing just the treatment results.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything in the control statistics that is notable? Like, for example, with Democrats, is there sort of already a saturation of control of like near 100% approval, and so the treatment effect can only go one way?
Yeah, so we don't see that across the results that I showed you for the most part, with the exception, I'm actually glad you reminded me. So with the one about will wildfires be more common in the future, I think we were hitting a ceiling effect there. Where I think the vast majority of respondents already thought wildfires are going to be more common in the future, so I don't think the treatment, so there are kind of two possible answers. One is it's a ceiling effect. The treatment just can't move that much because we're already at the ceiling. And the second possibility is they're effectively already treated because they already link the two, so you're not giving them any new information. That's the only one where there's a ceiling effect. Across the other results, that's kind of why I very briefly showed you the summary statistics. There is no concern about a ceiling effect. Yes?
There's a way of asking these questions a little different
Mm-hmm.
that I wonder if you'd be considering probing, which is to discuss the effect itself in terms of cofactors. Say forest fires are due to climate change and forest policy. Does that disarming leveling have an effect, particularly on Republicans?
I think it's a good question. So I mean, so what we did try to do to, I guess, alleviate kind of some of that concern is to be very careful with our language about, this is partially the result of climate change. Right, and we did that very intentionally because what we didn't want is for respondents to see this and say, well, that's wrong. That's not true. This is the result of climate change and bad forest management, which is true, to be honest. I mean, in California, at least, we did, I say we because, I'm moving to UC Berkeley, I guess, at this point. But I think there was, they did not do the controlled burns that the Native Americans had historically done. And, there was some bad forest management as well. So yes, we wanted to alleviate that, but we did not directly test, including that language. And so it is an open question of, to how that would change the results. I don't know. My prior is it wouldn't, but I can't say, I did not run the test, so I can't say that for sure.
You could have partially in and out of the question.
Yes, right. So that is something we could have done. We did not. It's always after the fact, after you run these surveys, everyone gives you great advice on all the additional. We were able to do the one, I think, crucial test, but this is a good suggestion. Thank you. Yes? Do you mean just to clarify, sorry, do you mean the policies for the mitigation policies or the adaptation tax for dealing with wildfires? The tax. Yeah, well, so the reason we did the tax is because we wanted to do something that was actually being considered and that was realistic. And that was kind of our goal throughout the survey, was to make it as realistic as possible. And so, there have been conversations about, we'll have an energy tax to help combat future disasters from climate change. Like that has been under consideration in California, for example. So that was why we chose that, because we wanted, and we wanted to be able to do it in a way that it wouldn't scream, this is about climate change, right? Because then that would treat them. So we were trying to kind of, that's why we chose that. In terms of the individual actions, I mean, so for the mitigation question, we both did the tax, obviously. To kind of replicate what we had done previously. And then we did the individual actions because I think, a lot of people believe that, what we do as individuals, the kind of lifestyle choices that we make have an impact on climate change. So, it just seems like, beyond government policy, looking at what individuals think they themselves could do is just kind of a standard thing you might want to ask. So it wasn't anything beyond that. I don't know if, yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
Might vary if you consider, like, not forest fires, but maybe saying, like, I'm from Missouri.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have forest fires, but the Missouri River is very low this year. Like, if you go to a setting like that where maybe action depends on, like, you jointly with
states or something, you know, like Missouri alone can't make the river rise again. Do you think these effects would be magnified in cases like that if you attribute climate change to factors that require your act, or if you attribute these bad weather-related shocks to, you know, things that require both your action and like action on behalf of others and whatnot?
Yes, that's kind of related. Let me just see if I can. I don't know how to click on, so let me see if I can get through it. Okay, one sec, because we did something. Okay, so this is a little bit related to one other test we did. It didn't make it into the body of the paper because the journal we submitted to had a short word limit, but we were trying to think about kind of diffusion of responsibility at different levels of governance, which I guess this kind of gets at, like, you know, maybe when you mention climate change, it makes people think that the level of responsibility should shift from like local government to national government, or we thought international government, because both of us are IPE, international political economy, so we needed to get some international element in there. It didn't work. So we didn't really see actually much, like the treatment didn't seem, at least to shift for the most part, people's views about the level of responsibility. If anything, it slightly shifted from, I guess, state to federal, but that's not really what you would expect if you think it's about climate change. It really should be from state to international. So there wasn't that much going on there. I do think that if you were to do something like certainly events that people perceive as less linked to climate, the less linked to climate change the natural disaster is, I think the stronger the effect would be, because like the more Republicans would be like, what are you talking about? This has nothing to do with climate change. So I don't know if like the Missouri River, like where that would fit. It might be, I think there's maybe less conversation about it, so obviously being climate change because it's happening in a more red state, whereas the wildfires have happened in a blue state, and so, or most of them have. And so there's like more conversation around climate change. So maybe like in people's minds, like they think there's more likelihood of a link. But I guess I don't know if that fully answered your question, but those were kind of my thoughts on that. Anyone else? All right, well, thank you very much for being a great audience. I really appreciate it.